Unto the Hills by Margaret Walker Freel. Chapter 15. Though Colonel Wogg had long since returned to Wilkes County to live, his many enterprises in Cherokee County, and most especially in Valleytown, kept him active in the affairs of the people of the town. It was the colonel's contention that the local post office should be in his trading post, rather than down in Jamesville. Billy could understand his wanting the post office because it would, no doubt, increase the business at the trading post, as all the locals would come to pick up their mail. I know Grandsire Whitaker won't want to give up the post office. I like the old man, and would hate to do anything that would displease him, commented Billy one day as he and Margaret were awaiting the outcome of a petition that had been presented to their representatives in Washington, D.C. The Walkers had about given up hope of a decision in their favor when a letter arrived from John A. Powell, the senator who had been elected to represent the state of North Carolina in Washington. The letter explained the delay in response was due to the time involved in investigating an allegation made by some of the people in Jamestown who objected to the moving of the post office. When the senator had proved to his own satisfaction that the allegations were false, and that the trading post was indeed a decent, law-abiding business establishment, he straightway made plans for the post office to be moved, and he named Billy as the postmaster. After reading the letter in near disbelief for the second time, Billy and Margaret sat in stunned silence for a short time. Finally, Billy said, "I knew those people down there wouldn't want to lose the post office, but I didn't think they would do something like this." Can you imagine anyone writing something like that to the congressman and getting people to sign the letter? Margaret couldn't believe the lengths that people would go to hang on to something they wanted. I guess it's hard for any of us to accept change. After all, the trading post is the most public place and the logical place for the post office. It's located more nearly in the center of the area it serves. More people live near it. I just hope those people up in Jamestown will come to see the advisability of the move, and we can all be friends again. "Oh, it just looks like nothing can be perfect in this world," said the unhappy Margaret. "No matter what, something goes wrong." "You're right. Paul used to say, you pay a high price for everything you get. Sometimes that price is pretty high." He paused for a spell and then added, "Well, it looks like we got the post office. Let's look at the commission." Awe and pride replaced the sadness in their eyes as they looked at the official document from Washington, embossed with the eagle symbol of the United States. "It's beautiful," breathed Margaret. "We'll have to frame it and keep it forever." Fall brought an added burden to Margaret. Both her parents were ailing, and she shouldered the responsibility of running both homes. She hurried through her own chores, set little Agnew on her hip, and scurried down the road to the Scott home. She handed the baby over to one of her younger sisters to mind, and she immediately started into the planned task for the day. "I thought we would get the soap made before weather gets here," she said cheerily to her mother, then abruptly turned to her sister. "Maria, did you put the bucket under the hopper like I told you?" At Maria's nod of assent, Margaret continued to give orders, and the younger children, recognizing her authority, accepted them with good grace, and the soap operation was underway. Even though John Scott's health was now impaired to the point that most of his waking hours were spent in his favorite chair, he was still interested in all that was going on. As always, he was pleased to have Margaret back under his roof, even for a short visit. "It's a good time for making soap. My folks always used to say," he began, and all the children knew he was about to repeat one of the Scotch superstitions which they had heard many times in the past, but which they always paid close attention to. "Make soap by the light of the moon, so's it could be white and firm." Yes, sirree, all the Scotch people believed in making their soap by the moon. It never fails. "Abram, be sure to get Margaret a sassafras paddle, so's the soap will smell good." All the Scott girls, except baby Laura, were busily making soap, and not paying attention to anything else. It had reached the stage for pouring into the wooden forms to cool and harden when Laura came hurrying from the house. "Careful, Laura," said Margaret, a little impatiently, as she pushed Laura away from the bubbling hot liquid. "Don't bother me now, honey. We're real busy." Laura persisted. "There's something wrong with Mother. Please come, Margaret. Mama is in bed crying. Paul says hurry." Margaret handed the sassafras paddle to one of the other girls and hurried into the house. "Laura, you stay here with the others." Laura, who usually followed close to Margaret's heels when she was at their house, didn't have to be told twice to stay with the other girls. Seeing her mother cry was enough to frighten her. "Mother, I'm sorry. I got so busy, I forgot to keep an eye on you." Margaret looked at her mother's tear-stained face. "Why didn't you call me sooner?" "Is it time?" Mary Scott said slowly. "Yes, it's time. Send for Grandma Collett. I was hoping to be able to wait until you finished the soap." "Oh, Mother," admonished Margaret. "The soap could have waited. Why didn't you say something?" She busied herself at getting her mother settled in bed and sent for the midwife. "Pa, you go on out in the yard in the sunshine with the girls." Pa was sort of like the children. He followed Margaret's suggestion and was happy to leave things in her capable hands. Later that day, once again, the family Bible was taken from the shelf to record yet another Scott arrival into the world. Iowa Agnew Scott, born November 20, 1846. Margaret sat down beside her father to catch a few minutes' rest. "Pa, Mother wanted to name this baby Iowa, and I wanted her to have part of your name, so we called her Iowa Agnew. Do you like that?" John smiled. "Sounds fine to me. Of course, I want her to have part of my name." A little more shyly, he added, "I was proud when you called your boy after me. It honors me and old Judge Agnew, too. He was a mighty big man in Gettysburg." Laura came in. "I want to see little Owie," she announced, and everyone laughed as they lifted her to inspect her new little sister. Her pronunciation of the name was to remain with the little girl for the rest of her life. John walked a little way down the road with Margaret as she headed back to her own house. "Look, Pa, the moon's pretty tonight. It has a circle around it. I guess that means rain. I'm glad we got the soap made before it started to rain." She changed the subject. "Guess I'd better try to catch a falling leaf as I walk home so's I won't catch a cold this winter." She knew she was repeating one of her pa's old sayings and that it pleased him to hear her say it. Then she called to him as she turned to go back into the house. "Tell Mandy to take good care of Mother and Owie. I'll be back early as I can in the morning." With that, she hurried home to get Billy's supper on the table before he came in from the store. The Scott family hardly had time to recover from the arrival of a new baby when they were hit with another surprise. Mandy announced that she and John Hayes had secretly married. They were aware that Mandy and John had been courting, but an elopement was not considered. At first, Mary was hurt to think that her daughter had run away to get married, but when Mandy quietly explained, "Mother, I knew with the brand new baby and Pa's being sick most of the time, you couldn't plan a big wedding for me like Margaret had, and I didn't want you fretting over it, so John and me just decided to run away." Tears came to Mary's eyes. Of course, Mandy was right. A big wedding was unthinkable at this particular time, and she and John did seem so much in love. She reached out and took them in her arms, giving Mandy her blessings and welcoming John into the family. Following Mary's lead, the entire family gathered to bless the young couple and to shower them with gifts for their new home. Very shortly thereafter, the newlyweds left to make their home in the neighboring state of Georgia. Winter found John Scott steadily growing worse. In spite of the efforts of the local doctor, it was plain to see that John was dying. One Sunday, John called Billy to his bedside and said, "Billy, I won't have enough time left to finish paying Wog for this land. What will happen to Mary and the children if he takes it away from them?" The old man's mind was quickly set at ease when Billy said, "I'll take out a new grant, and you and Mrs. Scott and the children can live here as long as you want to. Don't let it worry you." John Scott smiled and closed his eyes in peaceful rest. On July 28, 1847, John Scott died. His sorrowing friends and family laid him to rest in the little cemetery on the hill. Chapter 16. John Scott's death had left a void in the family life. The entire family felt the loss, but Mary and Margaret seemed to feel it more keenly. Mary, who had relied on John's strength all her adult life, was inconsolable. Margaret had been her father's pet, and he her idol. Words, especially empty phrases like "time heals," couldn't ease the pain. Margaret's pain at the death of her father was intensified by her sympathy for her mother, who was left with 8 children still to raise, including one only a few months old. Reality soon replaced sorrow. "What will Mother do?" she asked Billy. "She can't even call that house her own." Suddenly, Margaret's courage snapped, and she wept bitterly on Billy's shoulder. Days passed, and still Margaret did not return to her usual happy self. Billy was concerned. She seemed depressed, even fearful. One day, Billy came in and found Margaret lying on the bed and once again crying. "Margaret, whatever is wrong? You can't keep on like this. Your pa's been gone over a month. Things are all right for your ma and the young'uns. Abram and some of the girls are old enough to help her." Billy's encouraging words fell on deaf ears. Margaret would not be comforted. She was sorry for her mother and the children, but most of all, she was just plain sorry for herself. At last it occurred to her that she had a reason for her sorrow and pain. She cried out in anguish, "Billy, I'll tell you what's wrong with me. I'm in labor. Hurry and get Grandma Collett. The baby's coming. Don't bother Mother this time, just hurry." Now it was Billy's turn to be stunned. "You can't be having the baby yet. It's not time." "I know it's not time, but I'm having this baby. Hurry." Billy stirred into action and hurried off to get Grandma Collett. And Margaret was right. A short time later, the family Bible was brought down again to record yet another entry. William Pitt Walker, born August 27, 1847. Along with their growing family, the Walkers were also enlarging their worldly possessions. Billy had finished paying off old Wog for the trading post, and they were making plans for enlarging the house. Margaret and Billy were working on the details for the carpenters to begin their work. Billy tried to keep Margaret on the track, but she continually wandered off with such comments as, "I want Thomas to make me a pretty fireboard like Mother said they used to have in Pennsylvania. She said they called them mantles up there. He can carve it with his knife and make it a beautiful thing." "There you go again. All you study about are pretty things." "I guess you're right. I do like pretty things. I guess I got that from Mother." Margaret continued. "Mother is brave and never says anything, but she never did fit into these untamed hills like the rest of us. Now, take me. I love them. I love the mountains and the rivers. I love the beauties of nature. Mother, on the other hand, was born to wear pretty silks and laces, to have sweet-smelling sachet, to have slaves to do for her. Pa was my idol, but Mother was a born lady. I guess I'm more like the Scots, but I do want beauty in my home." "You're wasting more time. You still haven't told me what you want to do about the house. Since I bought the sawmill from Wog, we can have all the lumber we need. We'll frame the new part." "Let's add a bedroom on the north side, with a hall between. I don't want a dog trot, I want a hall. Then we'll make a parlor out of this room. Won't it be grand to have a parlor? I'll have a table there, and put the big seashell on it that you brought me from Savannah before Agnew was born." Margaret continued her planning. "Everybody is making their cook room separate from the big house. Let's do ours like that, and have a fireplace in there, big enough for me to walk into to hang the pots on the crane." Billy was taking in all of Margaret's suggestions. When she finally finished sketching out what she wanted, Billy said, "Thomas said he and the boys will come tomorrow to start the work. Now, there's something I want to say." Billy's usual quiet voice and manners were gone as he raised his tone and made gestures in his excitement. "You're always interested in beauty. I'm Irish, and anybody with Irish blood wants land and more than anything else. Land is the one thing in this world that is real. There's a big land sale in Murphy the day after tomorrow, and I'm going down and buy as much as I can. For you, I want the biggest house in this valley. For me, I want acres and acres of land. I want to own all the land up Junaluska Creek and on into Macon County." Margaret stood in silence as she watched Billy. Who could keep from being caught up in the face of such enthusiasm? She was so proud of her Billy. He was ambitious and willing to work to see his ambitions realized. However, Billy wasn't the only settler interested in acquiring land. On the day of the land sale, almost the entire male population of Old Valleytown turned out along with the people from Murphy, Hanging Dog, Chioa Valley, and Tusquity. The throng of excited humanity milled around the new courthouse. Since this was a first-come, first-served sale, there was much pushing and shoving to be first in line. The officials in charge of the sale became a bit concerned as the crowd grew more like a mob. They feared things would get out of hand. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Where's the entry taker? Where's Dewey Weeks?" "Oh, he's run off and hid. Probably locked himself up in jail." The voices became a continuous roar as the frenzied mob chanted, "We want land! We want land! We want land!" Again, one voice rose above the din, saying, "We'll come up and drag you down if you keep on hiding. We came to get land and we mean to get it." With that, the mob surged forward. They broke out windows with fists and sticks. They fought amongst themselves. They threw their survey and entry blakes inside at the frightened Dewey Weeks. Above the din of the fighting mass, a thunderous voice could be heard. "What the hell are you doing, Steve Whitaker? Damn your filthy soul! Get down from there and take your turn like the rest." This was followed by a chorus of hisses and curses from the maddening mob. Hemmed closely in by the struggling mob and being propelled along by its force, William Walker was startled to see his neighbor, Stephen Whitaker, crawling on all fours on the shoulders of the dense crowd. The greedy, land-hungry mob was so closely packed that it was possible for Stephen to scramble over the heads of the people. They were jammed so tightly into a mass that they were helpless as individuals. They could not lift their arms to defend themselves or dislodge the greedy man. In spite of the violent curses of the men under him, Stephen slowly but steadily made his way safely, grinning all the way to the window, and satisfied his wants. "Well, I never saw anything like this before," said Billy. "If Steve isn't the biggest hog I ever saw." Instead of cursing with the angry crowd, Billy burst into hearty laughter at the ridiculous episode. He accepted the inevitable calmly as he was moved forward, and finally he found himself in front of the land office window. He couldn't believe his good fortune. In spite of the long wait and the numbers of people who had preceded him, he was still able to purchase the land he had picked out for himself. This was Tract 45, 295 acres situated in Old Valleytown. Its value had been placed at $900 and was considered the most valuable and desired tract of land in eastern Cherokee County. It had been the site of an ancient Cherokee Indian village. It was the former home of Indian Chief Junaluska. William Walker rode tall and proud on his way home to give Margaret the good news. Billy's description of the scene he had witnessed and participated in was so vivid that Margaret could almost feel that she had been there herself. "I never saw so much confusion and greed in all my life. People fought and tromped on each other. Old Dewey Weeks was scared to death. You wouldn't have believed your own eyes had you seen Steve Whitaker crawling along the heads and shoulders of the crowd. It was so awful. It was ridiculous. I couldn't keep from laughing." "Might as well laugh. All I could do was stand there and be pushed along until my turn came. I couldn't believe my good fortune when by the time I got there this tract of land I had my heart set on was still available. I got the heart of old Valleytown. The Lord sure was good to me. Of course, He was good to you. The Lord blesses His people for doing right. Billy and Margaret watched with pride as under the skillful hands of the Tatham boys their house was transformed from a 2-room log cabin built by the Indians into a rambling 2-story dwelling with columned verandas. Billy wasn't the only member of the Scott family who was ambitious. Though he was aware that Margaret was happy with each addition to their worldly possessions, and that she scrimped and saved along with him in order to have things, he was, nevertheless, not prepared for her suggestions one night as they stood in front of their house, proudly surveying the results of their labor. "We'll have to stop for now," said Billy. "Until we've saved some more money, this size house will have to serve us." "Oh, this is beautiful, and certainly large enough for now. Don't you like the way the whitewash on the house makes it shine among the green hemlock trees? Just look how those trees have grown." "I sure have noticed how they've grown. They'll soon make fine logs for my sawmill," said Billy with twinkles in his eyes. "You'll never get your hands on these pretty hemlock trees. They'll stand right where they are for our children and grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren to play under." Then she moved closer to Billy and said in a cautious tone, "I've been sort of thinking about making our house into a tavern." Taking advantage of Billy's surprised silence, she rushed on. "The house is plenty big enough now. I can make some money by keeping folks overnight. Lots of travelers have no place to stay when they come from Aquan to Murphy. I have a big kitchen, and you said yourself that I'm a good cook. We could call it Walker Inn." Billy still hadn't had a chance to make a comment either in favor or against, and Margaret hastened to press her advantage. "You needn't say no. You know we need the money to finish paying for this land." Finally, she stopped talking and stood watching Billy uncertainly, waiting for him to respond. Billy's concerned expression gradually changed to a smile, and he leaned forward in a mocking bow. "Good evening, Mrs. Walker. Do you have a room for a tired and dusty traveler?" Happily, Margaret responded with a deep curtsy. "How do you do, sir? Yes, I have a very nice room. Hang your bridle there at the hitching post, and I'll have your horse taken to the stable. You will find the wash basin and fresh towels there at the well house. I suppose you are hungry, too. Supper will be served soon. Make yourself at home. My husband will be in from the trading post in a little while." They both laughed heartily, and before long the sign "Walker Inn" appeared on the front veranda, and guests began to filter in by foot, horseback, and stagecoach. Affairs were going rather well for the people of the valley. It was the spring of 1850, and as always, spring not only brings sunshine and flowers, it brings laughter and love to mankind. Margaret's days were filled to overflowing with the running of the inn and managing of her 2 small sons. She often called on her sister Maria to help. Tall, dark-haired Maria Scott had now reached the age of 22 years, which was quite an advanced age for a young girl still to be unwed. One morning, as Margaret and Maria were sunning the bedding, they saw a young man coming towards the inn. "Maria, there comes Josh Young again. Whatever do you suppose he's doing up here today? He was only here just yesterday." Maria flushed and hung her head as she hastily put a blanket on the line in the breeze. "I don't know what he wants," she mumbled. "I'll bet I know," said Margaret as realization dawned on her. "Maybe there's a little something of interest here for him. Why, Maria, you're sweet on that man, I do believe you are," she teased. "You're as red as a beet. It's spring after all, and it won't hurt to court a little. Why don't you walk away down the road with him?" Typical of the female creature, Margaret could not resist giving what she saw as a budding romance an added shove. She called to Josh. "Hello, Josh. Are you going down the road? If you aren't in too big a hurry, I'd like to have you help Maria take a bundle down to Mother's." Josh was grateful for Margaret's assistance. "Why, yes, Margaret. I'd be pleased to help you and Maria out a bit. That is, if Maria don't mind. I'm not in any rush, just going down to the trading post for a little while." Still slightly pink with an embarrassed pleasure, Maria responded demurely, "Why, thanks, Josh. I'd be pleased to have company." And with that, they walked off down the road, forgetting all about the heavy package they were supposed to deliver to Mother Scott. Margaret stood watching them for a few moments and smiled happily to herself as she returned to her work. That night, over her mending, Margaret said to Billy, "I believe we may be going to have a wedding in the family. What would you say to a match between Maria and Josh Young?" "I hadn't given it a thought," was Billy's reply. "I did see them walking by the store today, holding hands, but I'd say it's strictly their own business, and don't you go doing any matchmaking. Josh is a good fellow, and Maria's certainly old enough to get married." "Tell me about him. What kin is he to Tarplay Young at Red Marble?" "You're trying to find out if he comes from good enough stock to be worthy of your sister," said Billy teasingly. Before Margaret answered him, he added, "The Youngs are good people. Tarplay Young came from Burke County. He was one of the first settlers in this valley. Came about 1834, before the Indian removal. Took grants on lots of land up Red Marble way. I figure a man's all right if he saves, has some land, and pays his debts, and Mr. Young does all three. He's got several slaves. He's a justice of the peace. He's got a sister who came out here about a year after we did. She's married to a man who's an Englishman by the name of Young, but they aren't kin. The sister's got slaves. Josh is a cousin of Tarplay's. He came to the valley with James and his family from Burke. Josh sort of divided his time staying with James and Tarp. Josh is one of the best carpenters around here. He's really a fine cabinet maker. He also makes tintypes. Of course, you know that since he made the one of us. I hear he owns land over in the Pisgah section. I expect we would be a pretty good match. He would be a pretty good match for Maria, but don't you get involved in matchmaking. Let them do their own hitching." "Why, Billy, what a long speech. I never heard you make such a long one before. Wonder which justice of the peace will get to perform the ceremony, you or Tarplay?" In her mind, Margaret was already planning Maria's wedding. As soon as the marriage intentions were announced, she set about in earnest preparing for a happy celebration. Of course, the wedding had to be held in Margaret's big house. While Margaret and Maria and the other Scott sisters were weaving and sewing and planning, Joshua and Margaret's brother, Abram, built a snug home on Josh's land for the young couple to move into. On September 12, 1850, Joshua Alfred Young and Mary Ann Maria Scott were wed in the parlor of the Walker home. The valley people gathered to witness Tarplay Young pronounce them man and wife and to join in the happy festivities. Once Maria was happily married, Margaret turned her attention to her brother. Abram had always been so good to help Margaret when she needed him, especially in the hard task of harvesting flax and preparing them for weaving. She teased him about pretty Sally Ingram, and despite his embarrassed denials, she busied herself in weaving a linen tablecloth to present it to him and his bride. "Things sure keep growing around here," Margaret commented to herself as she sat weaving. "The boys are growing like weeds. The inn stays pretty full with travelers. We've already had to add more rooms to the house." As she worked and mused, she saw Grandma Collett coming towards her. Wise old Grandma Collett, who had delivered most of the babies in the valley over the past decades, felt quite free to offer unsolicited advice to the young mothers in the domain. "Margaret, it's time you were having more family to fill this big house," announced Mary Collett as she nodded her white head. "I was saying to your mother the other day, I said, a woman had better be a wife to her man, or if she don't, there'll be little uns away from home." Margaret laughed. No one could be offended by Grandma's plain, outspoken ways. Grandma had been too willing to help when she was needed, and everyone felt a close friendship for her. Margaret confided, "You don't need to worry about my Billy having little uns away from home. He's got another one due right here before long." "Well, I do declare," laughed Grandma. "Why don't you tell a body these things?" "Now, Grandma, don't tell me you didn't know. Just you own up. You could tell long before now." "I am pretty hard to fool when it comes to babies," admitted Grandma. "Just came round to check on about you when you'd be needing me. With one boy, 7 already, and another 5, you need another baby around the house." As Grandma left following her visit, she paused to say, "I didn't hear the katydids this year till way up in the fall. That's why we haven't had a frost. Abe always used to say you can look out for frost in 3 months from the time you hear the first katydids. I've never known it to fail." The following spring, Margaret gave birth to her 3rd boy. He was a frail infant who required much attention and care. He survived, but the family was so busy seeing that he did it, it was several days before the subject of a name was discussed. It was decided to name him Alfred, after Billy's next younger brother, and McLean for his Irish grandmother. So another name was added to the growing list in the family Bible: Alfred McLean Walker, born June 13, 1852. The death of Colonel Wog came as a shock to Billy and Margaret. Of course they were saddened over the loss of a friend and partner, but they were especially concerned when they received a letter from John Wog, the Colonel's brother and administrator of his estate, requesting immediate payment of debts owed to the Colonel. The young couple spent many anxious hours in composing a letter to Mr. Wog, explaining their financial arrangements with his brother and their plans for repaying their debts. This was followed by many more anxious days awaiting a reply to their letter. It was a kinder letter that brought a relief to their strain. Mr. Wog stated that the matter could be settled as they had suggested in their letter to him. He had no desire to seize their land from them, nor did he wish to sell it to other parties. He did wish to settle the estate at the earliest possible time. Margaret rejoiced that she had been foresighted enough to start keeping paying travelers in her inn and was able to help relieve some of the financial strain. In an effort to meet the physical requirements of keeping the inn running smoothly, Margaret and Billy decided to accept Billy's parents' offer of a slave. They had quarters prepared for the housing of the slave and sent word to Mr. and Mrs. Walker that they were ready for him. They started out with a healthy couple of blacks, David, who was the gift from Billy's parents, and Amy, who was purchased from one of the neighbors. This help in the inn and on the farm couldn't have been arranged at a better time, since Margaret's time was required by her sickly young son. Some nights she was up the entire night working with him, holding him up so that he could breathe. All the old home remedies were practiced. It was finally concluded that he was an asthmatic child and would always require special attention.